Okay, will be the two 15-minute presentations by our, and a warm welcome to our speakers, Daren Ranco and Clint Carroll. Thank you so much for accepting to be here and to share your knowledge with us. So the 15-minute presentations will be followed by a wider discussion and a Q&A in the remaining 40 minutes. Before I introduce our moderator, there are just a few housekeeping points I would like to make. So if you could please keep your microphones turned off during the presentations. The presentation will be recorded, so keep that in mind. And if you are uncomfortable, then keep your cameras off or on, as you prefer. By remaining in the room as we record the meeting, you consent to being recorded. The recording will be available on the CRASSH website and on the Indigenous Studies Discussion Group Cambridge YouTube channel after the event. We will only record the presentation, not the discussion afterwards, okay? Captioning has been enabled for this event. If you'd like to have captioning, you can select it at the bottom of your screen. Please note the captions are provided by Zoom and CRASH, or neither CRASH nor us, cannot be held responsible for the accuracy. And finally, we would like to provide an inclusive and safe environment in this online event. It goes, of course, without saying, we hope all attendees show respect and courtesy to the speakers and to each other throughout the event. And without further delay, I would like to welcome our moderator today, who then will take the lead on the conversation. So Tami Okamoto, thank you so much. Tami Okamoto is a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge in the Department of Geography and a National Geographic Explorer, or Geographic, sorry, Explorer. Her research interests include territory, critical indigenous geographies, and spatial epistemologies, praxis and embodiment in Amazonia. For over 10 years, she has collaborated with Amazonian indigenous organizations and autonomous governments in Peru at the interface of academia, policy-related work, and on-ground territorial struggles. Her PhD research project builds upon this ongoing engagement. It seeks to recenter indigenous geographies as a way to unpack the crisis of post-colonial territory in Amazonia. Tami, thank you so much for accepting, and the floor is yours.
Thanks for that, Mariana. So welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to be moderating this panel. So as Mariana said, the session will last an hour and a half, and we hope to have around 15 minutes of presentation of each speaker, and then some sort of a more open discussion among them, and to finalize the session, some questions from the audience around the general themes of this panel, but also people are welcome to bring in the research and the implications of that in our thinking. So to our esteemed panelists, first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Clint Carroll. Clint Carroll is an associate professor of Native American and Indigenous Studies in the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. He's a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. His longstanding work with the Cherokee people in Oklahoma aims to advance methods and strategies for Indigenous land education and community-based conservation. He writes and thinks at the intersections of critical Indigenous studies, anthropology, and political ecology. Dr. Carroll currently co-edits the Cambridge Indigenous Studies, the Cambridge University Press series, Elements in Indigenous Environmental Research. And he also serves on the editorial boards for Cultural Anthropology and Environment and Society. We then move on to Dr. Daren Ranco. Darren is a citizen of the Penobscot Nation. He's an associate professor of anthropology, chair of Native American programs at the University of Maine, and is faculty in the George J. Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions. His research focuses on the ways in which indigenous nations in North America resist environmental destruction by using indigenous science, diplomacies, and critiques of liberalism to protect natural and cultural resources. He has published in a range of topics related to indigenous lands and environments, including environmental risk and justice, climate change, invasive species, research ethics, and indigenous subsistence issues. A very warm welcome to both of you, and thank you for coming today. So before I ask each of the panelists to present, I thought I'd just briefly and broadly look at some of the concepts that bring us together today. Personally, I think the concepts in the title of this panel on well-being and the environment, traditional knowledge and conservation have the potential to contribute to a range of debates across disciplines and praxis. Definitely what I think is the one issue that brings us together to discuss the subtleties of indigenous-centered conservation and well-being, I would say, have to do with this questioning of a common claim that conservation projects can convert local people into long-term environmental stewards and improve their well-being. Evidence, however, frequently contradicts these win-win claims. Among the most prevalent conservation strategies worldwide are protected areas, community-based regimes, and market-based approaches. Among the benefits at the local and the global scales promised by projects, combining one or more of these strategies are biodiversity conservation, watershed maintenance, the reduction of poverty, the preservation of cultural values, meeting global food demands, mitigating climate change, just to give a few examples. Literature in the last 2 decades has noted how the proliferation of these initiatives has outspaced a critical examination of their impacts. Concerns tends to stress the limits or the limited understanding of how these initiatives shape local conservation and human well-being outcomes. At the margins of these debates, however, that are interested in how conservation strategies shape landscapes and well-being, however, seem to be questions on how indigenous peoples and conservation from indigenous frameworks rather conceive and shape from within the conservation and well-being debate and praxis. This approach to conservation and the environment draws our attention to the relativity of well-being. And also to the complex spatio-temporal relationality and the articulation of epistemologies and praxis that underlie contemporary conservation approaches in spaces considered, particularly in spaces considered ancestral lands or territories or reappropriated as such by indigenous peoples. So I think the work of our panelists today speak to some of these issues, and I think can help us to continue those conversations which are incredibly fruitful forward. So to start off, we have Dr. Clint Carroll, who will speak about Indigenous-led conservation as acceptation, engagements, and strategies in the Cherokee country. Please, Clint.
Oro, Tami, thank you. Osio ni gatawo, ukahati sikwani ohadawado, galieliga. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all the organizers, Mariana and the Indigenous Studies Discussion Group for having me here. I'm grateful to be here. I'm speaking to you from the territories of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations, more commonly today known as Longmont, Colorado. I teach at the University of Colorado at Boulder. And I want to present kind of a smattering of different, as I said in the title, strategies and engagements coming from my work with my Cherokee community, which is based in Oklahoma, but we're working outside of our reservation boundaries and thinking about conservation more broadly, as well as internally, and kind of having these discussions as a nation and thinking through what conservation means on a tribal level, on an indigenous level, to allude to what some of Tami was saying earlier. And so this all really kind of comes out of my longstanding work with Cherokee elders and knowledge keepers in Oklahoma, and really has a lot to do with how we address questions of environmental governance as an Indigenous nation. And these conversations have spanned from representation within our own tribal government and the systems and structures that we operate within that, as manifested in their current form, are not entirely of our making. And so there is a certain amount of imposition in how we approach the process and the project of environmental governance, including conservation. But I use the term exaptation in my title to imply and to really kind of signal my approach to thinking through these kind of structural issues and issues of process and governance, and highlighting how Cherokee people are working within our own institutions, as well as within foreign institutions like the National Park Service, the US National Park Service, to really think through strategically and to engage in ways that accomplish the goals that are really the foundation of how we think of ourselves in relation to the land. And that is compounded by numerous layers: historical, political, social, cultural, most notably in terms of where we are today as Cherokee people. The Cherokee Nation is not, does not inhabit our traditional homelands in the southeastern part of North America, or what is now called the United States. And so we think about relationality with land as being something that has been uprooted, but nevertheless continues in light of dispossession. And so that adds a layer to how I think about and how we're talking about conservation as Cherokee people in Oklahoma today. And so with that brief preface, I'll go ahead and share some slides, and we'll kind of work off of those. And this is all in the interest, as I said, of just kind of opening up discussion. I don't have a formal paper to read to you all, but hopefully, in dialogue, we can kind of unpack some of the material I'll be presenting. Give me a second real quick. Here we go. Okay, Mariana, can you give me a thumbs up if you see what I'm sharing here?
We can see it, yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
Great. All right. And so this image here, just to open up, and I will get into the more of the details later in the presentation, but this is an image taken from field work in Buffalo National River with our Cherokee medicine keepers. They're a group of fluent speaking Cherokee elders and knowledge keepers who lent their expertise and knowledge to enact really a landmark agreement between the Cherokee Nation and the National Park Service regarding gathering plants within Buffalo National River. And so this is an image here of Gary Van with the gray and green cap, speaking with a researcher, undergraduate researcher from the University of Arizona, who worked with us on this project. As you can see, a tour of young folks walking behind a national park ranger kind of encapsulates the nature of this work. But this was an ethnobotanical study that really was a foundational component of establishing this agreement, which excitingly was officially signed, made official, and the chief, our principal chief, signed the document just a couple weeks ago. So this is a photo from 2017, but the issue is very much recent. So I wanted to set things up by talking about how Cherokee people approach relationality with land, and really kind of the foundations of our work in conservation broadly today. And these are two phrases that are offered, that were offered to me by my elder John Ross, who is also a member of the Cherokee Nation Medicine Keepers. And the first one, Nigada Gusti Didada Ni, is the Cherokee way of talking about relationality. And it translates to we are all related, but the we and the all are expansive in terms of not just humans, but encompassing the more than human world, the land, the waterways, This is a pretty common throughout Indigenous languages. I hear more prominently the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota way of discussing this, Mitaku Yasin, but this is the Cherokee way of expressing this relationality with the land and all life. And the second one, Nigada de Dadani Lagi, so respect all things. And really things is kind of a gloss for what this means. It encompasses all life. So respect all life, respect everything. And so these are the ways that Cherokee people embark on this act of conservation, of strategically engaging with this notion of conservation from a Cherokee perspective. So I'll offer a couple other quotes that to me speak to the same concept. Crosland Smith, Cherokee medicine keeper and spiritual leader of the Cherokee Nation, has said, "We have to do something to honor the spirit of this land." And this was said in the context of, as I mentioned previously, being a dispossessed people, not being of the land that we now reside in northeastern Oklahoma, but this being a land that we've developed relationships to over generations nonetheless. And so this contemporary quote here from Crosland Smith is really embodying this sense of responsibility and of relationality to land that may not be the homelands, but are nevertheless a homeland. As well as this quote by Gary Vann, he says, "We were always told you come from the land and everything you need comes from the land. It's your fault if you go hungry." And this may seem kind of a harsh way of expressing relationality with the land, but that's the foundational underpinning here is thinking about when he was growing up and knowing that from the teachings he received from his parents and grandparents and from his community, the land was there to take care of you. And so if you don't enact that relationality through the knowledge and the practices that you've inherited from your community, then that's kind of his way of saying it's your own fault. So this is something that we take as a given, this relationship to land. And so as a conceptual framework, the way that I'm thinking about employing these frameworks, these relational frameworks in how we think about Indigenous engagement with conservation and the implications for health broadly construed. So community health, ecological health. I'm using this word exaptation in a subversive way. It's a term that it's coming from evolutionary biology and the history of technology. And it describes a trait or a tool that has been co-opted for a use that differs from its original purpose. And so sitting with that for a while as we think about Native engagements, Indigenous engagements with conservation, whether that be through, as I said, foreign institutions like our National Park Service in the United States, or whether it's articulating conservation from an Indigenous kind of nationalist framework, if you will, using more of a concept of territorial sovereignty to create conservation within existing reservation boundaries. These are all co-optations of conservation in the sense that Native people aren't taking for granted necessarily the formation of conservation enclosures as they originally came to be. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail soon. But I'm also thinking about this along the same lines as a strategic engagement with foreign systems and structures and mechanisms in order to regain access to land through myriad legal and political approaches. And then lastly, we go back to the quote that I presented earlier from Crosland Smith, thinking about these acts and these practices of conservation as a form of relational continuity, or the persistence of ethically and culturally grounded relationships with the land and non-humans, despite social and spatial change. And so Indigenous-led conservation disrupts this human nature duality that we see in dominant models of conservation by accounting for relationality with the land, as I've described previously, but also thinking about strategic engagements or the use of legal mechanisms. I'm drawing from Beth Rose Middleton's work, cultural conservation easements and the establishment of native land trusts as ways that Indigenous nations and communities can use dominant legal tools to, again, going up a bullet point there, to ensure access to land that really subverts or uses these tools in ways to accomplish Indigenous goals through Indigenous frameworks, but nonetheless, through the vehicle of dominant legal mechanisms like conservation easements. And then lastly here, enacting or reviving sustainable Indigenous practices on the land can enhance local ecosystem health. And I'll get to this in a minute, but also broadly construed notions of community health. And so through these acts, we see Indigenous-led conservation restoring connections to the land, and by doing so, resulting in spiritual and psychological healing for Native communities. And this is, again, taking a page from Beth Rose Middleton's really important work. I've got an image of her book here in a second to plug that really incredible piece of scholarship. But also restoring Indigenous access to the land in the context of settler colonialism and dispossession contributes to how we might think of environmental justice for Native communities when put in that framework of settler ongoing and structural expressions of settler colonialism. Indigenous conservation is really an act of environmental justice. And so this is Beth Rose Middleton's book that I mentioned previously. And so from this point on, I'm going to go through and describe a couple of projects, a couple of recent news items that relate to the work that we've been doing. And then I will try to keep an eye on the time here and make sure that we have plenty of time for discussion and for Darren's presentation. But this was taken a couple weeks ago, and it's an image of our medicine keepers, representatives from the National Park Service, and tribal elected officials, including our principal chief in the blue tie there, Chuck Hoskin Jr., announcing and formally signing an agreement with Buffalo National River, as I mentioned previously, but also announcing in tandem the establishment of the Medicine Keepers Preserve in Adair County in the Cherokee Reservation in northeastern Oklahoma. And this is really a product of years and years of work. And as I mentioned, working in tandem with, in collaboration with Cherokee elders, our medicine keepers, to have those discussions around not only internal issues of governance, of environmental governance as they pertain to land conservation and the influence of traditional knowledge, Cherokee knowledge that is coming from a position of elder knowledge keepers who have been raised with land-based knowledge, and that includes medicinal knowledge, how to identify foods, wild foods, as well as materials for various crafts, and really kind of encompassing that relationship with the land that is not necessarily taken for granted among all Cherokee people. And that is having to do with two main issues here. One, assimilation and the attempted eradication of Indigenous cultures by the US colonial government. And that's through boarding schools, as well as through the second one, the theft of land that we've experienced significantly, not only due to dispossession from our homelands, but after the arrival in what is now northeastern Oklahoma, the allotment policy, in which we lost 98% of lands that once used to be Cherokee owned. And so these acts are hugely significant, both in terms of the cultural loss that we've sustained, but have been resilient throughout and have been able to maintain, through the work of the medicine keepers, but also through the theft of land that has really constrained our ability to actively relate to places and actively go and harvest and interact and be in relationship with the land itself. And so we see the medicine keepers preserve. You'll see it on to the right of the screen here, kind of a detail, fuzzy in our view, but a map of where this preserve is. I don't have an image for you today, but to look at the tribal trust land holdings that the Cherokee Nation has today in comparison to the 4.42 million acres of lands that we once used to own in fee simple communally by the people, it really is a dismal picture. And so the act of preserving a tract of land within that is really significant when you think of it in light of all of the above. This is an image of a portion of that preserve. And in fact, this English name, the Medicine Keepers Preserve, does not really get at the full meaning that the medicine keepers have given this place. It's a beautiful, almost 1,000 acres tract of land in eastern Adair County. And they refer to it in the language as Nawatohiada Nawoti'i, or the peaceful place of medicine. And so therein encompassing a sense of connection that exceeds conservation, it exceeds preservation. It's more about enacting and voicing a relationality with land that implies its value in terms of healing and in terms of peace and in terms of connection. And so with that, I know I am running short on time. I'm almost at my 15-minute mark. I want to show a clip here of just coming from the words of John Ross himself that really speaks to the perspective that we've encountered and we've been working to kind of project among all Cherokees and beyond of what it means to conserve land from a Cherokee perspective. And again, John Ross is a fluent Cherokee speaker. He's one of our medicine keepers. And in this clip, he talks about the connection between land and health. And I'll just give a brief setup to the video first. This is a photo voice video. And so what we did back in 2015 was we convened the medicine keepers. We talked about what a photo voice project is, which simply speaking, it's you have a group, a community, a group of people who go out and take pictures on their own about these themes related to the themes that the project defines. And it's a community defined project. And so the themes of this project were land and health. And so these are in John Ross's words and through the images that he took, what land and health, a brief clip of what land and health mean to him. And well, hopefully this works.
And every plant was important to Cherokees. We don't know half of as much as our ancestors did. But they didn't have hospitals, and that's what they used these plants to keep healthy. And we need to learn from that. We eat more wild foods, and if we use the medicines that our people used, it will be in a healthier state. And the only way we can preserve it is, we got to protect it. And there's few areas that you can find all these medicinal plants. But there's a lot of farmers and ranchers. They'll just cut everything out to raise cattle. And the Cherokees didn't like that when I was growing up. That's where Cherokees used to hunt, and now they can't go in there. That's where they used to gather, even to go look for wild onions. And that's what was important to our people. It still is. You can't go in those places anymore. We need to preserve our area somewhere. We're losing a lot of our culture, even our language, and the language that goes along with our culture. We've got names of all these trees and plants and our environment that we have, and if we don't protect that, we're going to lose it all. I've been advocating for a number of years, and it's to have our own national park. We can call it Cherokee National Park, but we need large acreage just for our environment to go back to a natural state. And it takes a lot of work, but I think it would be beneficial to really start thinking about something like that. Set aside, 10,000 acres. If we had that much acreage, we wouldn't have to worry about, losing it. Somebody bulldozing the trees and plants and everything away, and putting cattle in there, destroying the environment. We could protect that for our future generation. It's never too late to do that.
Okay. Oops. Let's see if I can get back on track here. So I'm going to have to wrap up, and I'm leaving a lot out, so hopefully this will come out in the Q&A and discussion. But what I wanted to close with was, thinking about, again, going back to the conceptual frameworks, going back to thinking through Cherokee ethical and relational frameworks of what this work entails amid the structural and ongoing conditions of settler colonialism. You heard John Ross talk about what we're constrained by, and he mentioned a figure of 10,000 acres, and that is an aspirational goal, because the reality is we're working with much limited areas and that have been checkerboarded, and so we don't really have the ability to contiguously draw a line around 10,000 acres, but we can do so in piecemeal fashion that in fact is actually an expression of more localized forms of conservation, and can be seen as a more strategic way of protecting certain areas that communities therefore have ownership to in the local context, or have ownership or stewardship of. And so that kind of segues into more recent work that we're doing together through a grant from the National Science Foundation to really understand these questions of access and have really Cherokee understandings and experiences navigating such a fractionated landscape inform a comprehensive tribal conservation plan that again may not be in terms of the ideal scenario, but engages strategically with what we're dealing with and what we have to work with now. And that, of course, leading to both psychological health and physical health in terms of just maintaining our connection to the land as Cherokee people, and seeing the implications from that unfold within our communities. So I'll end there. Thank you very much, Wadon, and I look forward to hearing from Darren.
Thank you so much, Clint. That was absolutely fascinating. So our next speaker is Dr. Daren Ranco. So Darren is going to speak to centering Wabanaki peoples and nations in land protection and conservation. The floor is yours, Darren.
Chihuahuan, thank you so much. Gwegwe Dagakio, Natalawisi, Daren Ranco, Bonoviskewi, Wabanaki, Neme Benage. So pleased to be joining you all this afternoon, evening there. Yeah, I'm Daren Ranco, and I'm actually zooming you from my own tribal homelands in a place now called Dedham, Maine, but we call Neheme Benage or Turkey Hill. So there's a lot of turkeys that run around my hill here in the hills country near in my homelands. And I want to share with you, and I guess before I start, I'd just say Clint's work is really guiding in this, and in some ways he's been doing the engagements with conservation longer than I have. This is my newest frame of research. Please check out Clint's book, Roots of Our Renewal. It's an amazing accomplishment and book. And he mentioned Beth Rose Middleton's work. Trust in the Land is also quite important and extraordinary for this piece. So let me share my screen here. So hopefully that looks right. Yeah, so again, this is newish work for me. But I do have some goals. I want to talk about some of the opportunities that we're seeing in my homeland around Indigenous-led conservation, which is cut up in sort of the political movements related to land back and rematriation, but also it's responding to specifically Wabanaki engagements and responsibility to place. I'm gonna hint at, I underlined and bolded this, but I do want to talk about some of the pieces of evidence related to Indigenous-centered conservation work, as much as what I say and engage with land conservation groups, but sort of where that puts us in relation to this work, and then identify best practices for establishing Indigenous-led conservation work. And because this is the work I'm engaging in is definitely to think about how the collaborations can happen with Indigenous leadership. So this is just a map of the state of Maine, what is now the state of Maine. And these are all the protected lands for conservation, even public lands, basically lands that have some level of conservation and protection, either as federal, state, or land conservation. The light green is the land conservation, and the dark green is the sort of state and federal piece of this. This represents roughly 23% of the state of Maine, and as Wabanaki people, this is also for us what we're seeing as part of an opportunity. In case you don't know where our tribes are, I always have to say that this is who where the four tribal nations and 5 reservations are located in what is now Maine, but also our lands. We do have under our control over 300,000 acres of land as Wabanaki people in the state of Maine, the majority of which were part of a land claim that was settled in 1980, which also that legislation came with some really disastrous poison pills as it relates to our sovereignty. But we do have this work across the tribes, these lands that we either have in trust or in fee that we manage directly. Another key part of this work and what gets mobilized really more importantly is that our territory as Wabanaki people is not bound by the state of Maine or the United States. It stretches into what is now Canada, and it's when we enact our collective work as Wabanaki nations, which is a confederacy and a cultural grouping. We enact it in all of our homelands, and I think that's critical to this work. For us, we really want to, when we think about responsibility to place, this is our place, and luckily we have not been moved out of our place, although we have been managed, and lands have been taken from us in dramatic ways as other Indigenous people. So I think this is a critical frame for me and how to think about this work. I'm sure many of you are aware of various Indigenous led movements for land return and rematriation. I do want to just get a little bit on the definitions of that, because I think sometimes folks are a little loose in the definitions. For me, each of these movements, the political and cultural interventions that are anti-colonial, they each reference and center right relationships between humans and non-humans. Land back is a much more explicit political movement in terms of it being a call to return everything stolen from us as Indigenous peoples: land, language, ceremony, medicines, kinship, that sort of thing. Rematriation work is much more engaging in a cultural movement. It explicitly centers women and tradition, not sort of colonial men types of leadership and propertied systems, but really is about returning our relations and maintaining them. And it strikes me, I've seen, I sometimes quote a tweet I saw from a young Indigenous activist who said, the land wants us back as well. And I think that notion of the agency and the responsibility that rematriation is about is a critical part of this. And in my mind, each is maybe perhaps incomplete, or it doesn't fully capture kind of the moment. And I think thinking about each kind of frame is important. It'd be silly for me as a Wabanaki man without referencing rematriation, without referencing Sherry Mitchell, who's an author and thinker. It's also Penobscot, and sort of thinking about why this is important work in terms of our responsibilities and the role of Wabanaki women. She talks about Wabanaki women being once again at the center of our communities, leading the work to recover our traditional ways of knowing and being through language, renewal of kinship networks, revitalization of land-based teachings that focus on the relationships that exist between all systems within creation. The women are also decolonizing our stories, developing pathways for food sovereignty, and protecting our lands and waters. And her organization, the Land Peace Foundation, upon which I'm on the board of, has a project related to this, which I don't have time to go into today. But it's a really extraordinary example of what I think is rematriation work. In the context of scholarship and why this is important, in what we're facing as possible engagements and possible dilemmas and political arguments for and against is, and this World Bank report is quoted publicly and privately a lot. Sometimes it's not even referenced. It just, there's a sort of like a factual kind of frame to it in terms of the political movements. But I do think it's when people talk about Indigenous people having coinciding and living on the areas that hold 80% of the planet's biodiversity. This report has been challenged in interesting ways. I think there are ways to do it conceptually, there are ways to do it percentage-wise, but I think it shifted the discussion, and it's shifted scholarship, which I think has gotten more nuanced and more finely attuned in a variety of ways. I don't have time to go into all of that scholarship. I will say that I was a party to one of the pieces of that scholarship, and just one frame of it that looks at it uses some really new tools to look at the impact of human management and human influence on terrestrial nature over the last 12,000 years. And I think for us, when we look at how humans have shaped environments in the last 12,000 years, it actually hasn't. It's been, depending on how you want to frame it, humans have not been universally or always a problem. In fact, humans have shaped and managed terrestrial nature in a lot of positive ways for a lot of the 12,000 years. Last couple hundred, not as good. And in this piece, we talk about how the current biodiversity losses are caused not by human conversion or degradation of untouched ecosystems, right? This idea that it's humans versus untouched ecosystems, but in fact, the losses have been caused by appropriation, colonization, and intensification of use in lands inhabited and used by prior societies, i.e. Largely indigenous peoples. So that frame of, is also a hopeful frame. Humans aren't necessarily the problem, although our current systems of extractive colonialism and capitalism are not helping clearly. So it's into those spaces of scholarship and the politics and movements that we as Wabanaki people have started to more directly engage with land trust and conservation groups in our region. And it led to the eventual, and I'll talk more about the creation of a commission with representation from all our tribes related to this work. It started first though with some of us who are educators and sort of other kinds of leadership roles, meeting with the land trust community in the state of Maine. And they, in response to some of these meetings, they formed what was called the First Light Learning Journey. And that really was about conservation, land trust organizations, and the Wabanaki tribes thinking about how to rebuild Wabanaki stewardship and presence across the landscape. And we were inspired by Beth Rose and her book and a lot of the work that Cherokee is doing and that Clint's talked about, looking out that this is actually a possible thing. And of course, it's about restoring our prosperity, expanding our stewardship through collaborations and acquiring lands through and thinking about this in terms of land back and rematriation as well. So that learning journey was started out first as an opportunity for people in the land trust community to learn more about, and because they didn't know who we are, and for us to learn a little bit more about them, but also to kind of it was a kind of learning journey and a series of commitments by land trusts in the state to kind of formulate and reformulate their commitment towards Indigenous peoples. In response to this work, I helped organize, these are all, the commission, the Wabanaki Commission on Land Stewardship is made up of 2 representatives from each of our tribal nation governments here in the state, was the state of Maine. And so it serves in this function around our diplomacy. It accesses a lot of the protocols and traditions of working together across our landscape. So luckily that helps us work together and then engage as we used it during the more directly European colonial period, ways of focusing our energies and working together. It's obviously the mission, again, that it was only seeded in January of 2021, so we're just a little over a year into this work. So I'm gonna, the mission is clear, reflects this engagement, improve the health and well-being of Wabanaki people through sustained effort to expand our access, management, ownership of lands, to practice our land-based cultures. And the mission is supported by acquiring lands, sharing and co-managing land that is currently owned by land trusts and conservation organizations. And we do this through partnership and education that reflects our knowledge systems, expertise, and perspective. Even though this is early on, we've had over 1,500 acres of land returned. There's thousands of acres that are in negotiation or under some part of a process to be returned. And then we've also created sort of access agreements. And I know that this is work that Clint has been engaged in with parks and different things. And that's part of the work here, but also with land trusts, sort of permits for gathering, these sorts of things. And so thousands of acres have been opened up in that way. And we're working on the possibilities for things like cultural use agreements, which are tools which create more permanent access points across land trusts, lands, and conservation easements. As one of the people organizing and trying to bring this into being, it takes a lot of time, staff. It needs to be community driven. How the commission itself thinks about its work as a clearinghouse for all the tribal nations, and how we maintain our role, reflecting our diplomacy traditions, is really, really important. I sometimes share this, with land trusts and conservation groups in particular, that there are, this isn't the new work. Most of you probably know that. This is just from some work done in what is now Australia, known as Australia, some conservation best practices that land trusts and conservation groups can do. So, this form of engagement and the politics of it, in terms of, oh, we don't know, there isn't a way to do it. We're into this pretty deep, and this is work that's being mobilized and implicated in a lot of different policy regimes related to both biodiversity, but also just land protection. There are these movements for protecting lands, 50% of lands by 2050, or in the US there's this 2030 goal of 30% of lands, and sort of the role of Indigenous people in this is going to be quite critical as we think about, because the best, the scholarship, I guess, in terms of, before I go to my last slide, the scholarship basically says Indigenous peoples, when Indigenous peoples are leaders or in partners in conservation work, those are the best, most effective forms of land protection. When it's just conservation groups without Indigenous leadership, it's not as effective. It tends not to be as expansive in that work. So I'd say, in conclusion, reflecting on this work, it's a new project for me. So it's one of these heart pieces of work for land return. The fact that I'm in my territory and we're trying to do this work holds a lot of hope in doing these engagements. I'm not so surprised, and nor should anyone else, that there are ongoing legacies around the colonial structures of property regimes that have impacted us and extracted so much of our lands from our control. And one of them that is really interesting, and people have talked about too, is that, and Beth Rose in her book and others, that conservation easements are often tied to the easements, the legal protections are tied to colonial structures, right? Sort of in asking the question, how can Indigenous leadership work in these situations? Oftentimes the easements require, evidence that that humans are not harming things, and then what kind of evidence does that look like? And how does it need to be monitored? These are all really tricky questions, and they, as we get into the details of them, they can be almost traumatic, because it's sort of like, oh, well, we'll just have one of our land managers observe you as you're gathering, and that was just like an absolute no-go. So it's those kinds of situations that need to be addressed, that are kind of their own form of legacies. And then sort of land back, rematriation are interconnected and need each other. And really, one of the things that we try to do is ask land trusts and land conservation groups, is sort of what kinds of opportunities and barriers are there in advancing these kinds of relationship and doing this work. So thank you so much. I'll end there. I'm slightly over time, and yeah, it's really great and being here.
Thanks so much, Darren. Those were also some great pictures that I just making the account a lot more vivid. So thank you so much. So I thought I would just open the floor now to some discussion among our panelists. And I'd like to start off by allowing you yourselves to comment on each other's presentations as well, and each other's experiences. Clint, I don't know if we could start with you, just to follow the same order.
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Darren. And it's really awesome to hear about this work. And, you know, I have a lot of questions. I guess my big question has to do with strategy and how. So on a couple of different notes, like one, you know, the engagement with these existing conservation zones, if you will, or established conservation lands through that mechanism of land trust or through the mechanism of conservation easements, and how that may or may not relate to kind of a comprehensive understanding of climate change in the midst of it. So, and I'll back up a little bit and explain why this, why I'm thinking about this, because I think conservation as we know it, you know, thinking back to what we both have said about this kind of dominant system or structure of, you know, placing a boundary around a certain tract of land, you know, and how that is kind of, the roots of that are in, you know, colonialism, but also, you know, enclosures that go all the way back to like England and the, I don't know, 15th, 16th century, something like that, as a mechanism for, well, doing exactly that, enclosing a tract of land, and then, you know, in their origins, they were for elites to hunt within them. And so then you've got the criminalization of people who go in and gather wood or whatnot, usually, you know, peasant or local people. So given that framework of enclosure, and then when we pair that, or we put that in the context of climate shift and climate change, they don't match up. They're, and so I wonder if that's an element to your work is, you know, yeah, we're dealing with these like, you know, fixed boundaries, but we know that, you know, the natural world and you know, ecological processes and animals and then we've got the compounded effects of climate change and the shift therein, don't obey these kind of political borders, right? Or these socially constructed boundaries. So I wonder, like, to what extent is that also a part of the work y'all are doing and thinking strategically about, you know, the underlying foundation of rematriation and land back and reconnecting to lands and that kind of thing.
Yeah, Clint, thanks so much. And, you know, again, your work, you know, we have so many projects, and one of the, in that last picture, the in the center with the red vest is a Maliseet graduate student of mine named Suzanne Greenlaw, who's doing work in Acadia National Park that really builds on some of the work that you guys have done in parks and working with parks. But, you know, she's been able to design, you know, in terms of these access, you know, protocols that are in parks in terms of our gathering. Yeah, she's really able to flip it on its head, showing the ways in which even the research design on a lot of these projects, as you know, Clint, are like completely, you know, quote unquote scientific, and yet totally devoid, you know, totally don't look or appreciate what it is that Indigenous gathering and management is about, or stewardship is about. To your larger question, you know, the project that kind of brought me to this one was about our related to climate change adaptation, and so we've been taking actually some leadership in just in the last couple of months with NE CASK and doing some work in our region around that. But I would say at its core and is about food sovereignty. You know, I think you know, that was so powerfully given by the video you shared. You know, the idea that, you know, us relying on ourselves in our lands and bringing that work together is really I think, you know, why you know, in some ways rematriation, examples of rematriation can look like a food sovereignty community, often. I mean, it can look like a lot of other things culturally, right? It can look like broader stewardship and activities related to teaching and learning. I think it's all those things, right? So
Right.
I guess I think for me, it is, if I were to, categorize it under, is it food? I think the climate and the access points do recenter like what the purpose is. And I think it is that it is about relationships rooted in our own food sovereignty and ability to maintain ourselves in our homeland. I guess I think going back at you in terms of, I think the enclosures is what I was trying to say, like even the easements themselves are so screwed. They're so tied to like, wilderness and like no people. Of course, these protected enclosures are like, the first thing they did, of course, was kick us as indigenous people out of these places. Yeah. So I think it's like, this, it's very, you have to be so self-conscious and opportunistic, at times. And I guess, kind of back at you, like in terms of, the possibilities of this work, in terms of what you all are doing down there in Cherokee, like, what are the best possibilities? I think these openings, I'm a realist, like, yeah, I was like, okay, let's move. We got 1,500 acres back. that's a thing. Like, it's like tangible. Like, and like, we can touch it. We can feel it. So all that. For you all, I know that in terms of parks and other things, you guys have been doing this a lot longer than we have. So I just, in terms of that engagement and ability to kind of regain or what are the best possibilities of that, or how do you think about that strategically, I guess?
Yeah, and what my mind goes to is how, from that perspective, and I think this is illuminated in the work that you shared, and then the way that we think about our work, even if not explicitly stated by the medicine keepers, but how land back is expansive and multifaceted. In addition to what you said about the kind of definitional, like, okay, this, like, what's the phrase? I think this is Leanne Simpson, who I'll paraphrase here, but like the opposite of dispossession isn't possession, So kind of recentering relationships as opposed to like a repossession or, something entrenched in the property system and kind of patriarchal or heteropatriarchal ways of seeing the world and commodifying nature. And so, I look at these, you mentioned these strategies as kind of being realist, and absolutely, to me, it's like, okay, yeah, land back, absolutely. But it's what I love about the movement is that it's in your face, kind of a ultimatum, like all of it back, right? Like you said, all of these things. It's not just land, it's not just ownership or property, it's everything that was lost and that was stolen. And then in the process of doing that, we see these projects that, I really wanted to plug Beth Rose's book because she has a sentence in there, a section where she's like, the ideal is all of this back, right? Like she's not saying that this is the pinnacle, like native land trusts and cultural conservation easements are the pinnacle. She leaves that open to say like all of it back and in indigenous hands or under indigenous kind of frameworks of care, whatever you want to call that, management, stewardship, etc. But these are mechanisms through which we're seeing that happen and a lot quicker, right? Like relatively speaking. So that to me, it speaks volumes about, okay, how do we, again, think of this as strategic engagement? Think of it as ways of getting what we need access to, what we, so land back in many different shades, or there's a spectrum of that project that keeps that ultimate goal in mind. That's the compass, or the North Star, if you will, but also continues to work incrementally, strategically, relationally. Like even the project, the Buffalo National River Project was, I mean, it was like honestly, from inception to 2 weeks ago, it was 8 years. And so, yeah, of course, some of that, a lot of it was bureaucracy, both tribal and National Park Service, right? But an equal amount was relationships. And so I think that's a part of the equation, is that, and this is where it gets, nuanced, and it gets, a little messy, but in a good way, is that, some might say you take like kind of a radical approach, like, why are you engaging with the US government at all, right? And there have been criticisms about the gathering rule that was established in the Federal Register in 2016, about like, why do we need to do this, that, and the other to do something that we just have a right to, plain and simple. And, I get those critiques, and I totally understand that, it can rub people the wrong way when, for example, you have to talk about your plant knowledge in order to establish the agreement and then enact the gathering. But the way that we did it, and so I've got a forthcoming publication about the process, was, each step of the way was consultation, and was, I acted as kind of a liaison between the research team, the National Park Service, and the medicine keepers, and was like, okay, we're going to talk about the ethnobotanical study. How much are we going to talk about these plants? And in that consultation process, it was bare minimum. We're going to establish some baseline information that, if people get a hold of the information, they're not going to say, oh, basically it addresses the history of exploitation and of, on the flip side, ridicule of indigenous knowledge that Cherokee people and many other indigenous people aren't willing to share those intimate and intricate details of, for example, medicinal knowledge. And so to address that in a way that was like, okay, well, what do we feel comfortable with sharing in order to achieve this goal right here? And that was a process of relational work. And it was, so process and relationality were key. And so these type of things is kind of where I tend to reside, as opposed to the kind of more oppositional framework, which again, it's not that I'm, disparaging folks who are just, wanting to go for it all. But, the reality that that's not going to happen tomorrow. What can we do to kind of keep moving forward in the meantime? So anyway, that's kind of my
it's been so funny. Like, let me just share some this emotional thing that I've experienced in the last year, where, intellectually what drew me to the work, the idea that, as you know, Clint, I have a law degree, so I'm like, oh, we can write these, cultural use agreements, which they have a lot of them in California. Part of it is the way that the conservation easements work out there, and then you realize, oh, there are sort of this regular, like the situation I talked about, where it's like, oh, we need to measure. I mean, it's even worse than the having to do an environmental assessment and then a finding of no significant impact, right, which is the federal government side of it. They're like, no, we need to monitor all the human activity on our conserved land. And they're like, well, that's not going to happen. So I was like, screw it. We're just forget about any of those agreements. We're just going to buy the land back. So one way or the other, it's like, it was that emotion to realize, like, my God, the colonial sort of, like, the idea that we would do it in partnership with, their tools are just so, like, driven by these very, like, they're created against us. It feels like really personal, like these tools are against indigenous use, right? They're purposely meant to, like, insult us. That's what it's probably not true, but I'm just saying, like, that sort of emotional sort of landscape. I mean, I've come back from that emotion around it, but I think I just wanted to share that because I think, that's, as you do this work, and when people talk about these systems, the property systems, I mean, I can, do the anthro speak around it, but I mean, those regimes and how they function on the ground, right? That's what we are trying to understand here, is they function as a colonial insult. So much yet, here we are. We have people who want to do the right thing with us, in partnership with us, and they're like, maybe we can find it, maybe we can change some legislation, maybe we can, I mean, maybe there's ways into it. And because, our elders are always like, well, the land will come back to, that this is this view, which is it'll come back, kind of in a way, like that faith in that that we're here to stay, they're just sort of visitors, kind of.
Yeah, absolutely.
If I could ask you, just like for everyone and in the audience, that if they have any questions, I just remind you that you can raise your hand or put it into the chat and I can read it out loud. But meanwhile, I also wanted to ask you, Darren and Clint, if talking about this thing about moving forward that you were saying, Clint, how to move forward, and I wanted to ask you whether there's something about the interaction of knowledges and praxis that you were, both of your works speak to, and it made me think about in which ways do you see this also as an opportunity in terms of, I mean, clearly, Clint, when you talk about this term that has to do with the acceptation, like a way of co-opting conservation, or like the way in which mainstream conservation is conceived, but there's more than that. There's like an excess of that Indigenous peoples, or a conservation framework for Indigenous perspective is also taking on board in terms of conceiving conservation also as an alternative to the ways in which well-being itself is conceived, and including, for instance, recentering health in conservation initiatives, and whether in that sense, that concept that you're putting forth and the relationality aspect that you both talk about, whether with the land, but can we also talk about relationality in terms of knowledges that are, sort of being entering in dialogue in the processes that you both describe as like the rematriation, the land back movements, but also the small scale initiatives that you both engage with. Is there something about the different knowledges and practices that are enacted or interact in the forms of conservation framed by the Wabanaki, by the Cherokee and other peoples, that sort of show an opportunity, some sort of hope, or that you can see as a way of moving forward?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Like, I think I've been thinking about this, so it's interesting that you mentioned, future and hope, because I've been working on a piece with my current graduate student on Indigenous optimism in the colonial scene, is what we're calling it. And this gets back to kind of what Darren, you were talking about, as far as a critical take on what has become commonplace in terms of the use of this term, the Anthropocene. And you illuminated this in your talk, Darren, but that, it's less about, and I thought that you're bringing up the kind of original source of that statistic or whatever, that those numbers from the World Bank report was really helpful, because as you said, I'm seeing it everywhere, and that's kind of like the rallying cry. But from your take on it, your perspective of like, oh, hold up, like in a sense, it's still kind of that, even that passage from the report, it's still erasing Indigenous, it's erasing colonialism, and it's erasing what has led to the current moment of dispossession. And it's taking for granted that there is this kind of image of these pure Indigenous people with their pure lands, and and defending them, when it doesn't reveal the centuries of extraction, exploitation that are hand in hand with colonialism and capitalism and imperialism. It's kind of a blanket statement that is very, very close to talking about the Anthropocene without a critical understanding of which human, and who are the anthro in the Anthropocene. And granted, like I'll be the first to say that even in our indigenous nations, and Cherokee Nation is certainly an example. We have a variety of perspectives on what it means to interact with the land that aren't always in alignment with our traditional, or whatever you want to call them, our ancestral teachings. And so that's an issue that, and I'll come full circle to your question, Tami. I think I'm getting off on a little bit of a tangent here, but it comes back to the issue of like the significance of a group like the Medicine Keepers in influencing policy decisions. And one thing that I wanted to mention, going back to the Photo Voice project, was that method, for those who don't know about it, it originated in community health, community-based health promotion work, and in the 80s, and was intended to directly influence policy. And so we use that as a tool, that method, and this kind of the package that we ultimately ended up with was the video. And I actually have the link that I can post in the chat. You can watch it on YouTube if you want. But that directly influenced our tribal counselors, our elected officials, to in turn, however many years later, look, where are we at? 7 years later, establish the Medicine Keepers Preserve. So that's not a given, even within our own tribal communities, that we're going to conserve land. There's a long history of kind of just going along with former Bureau of Indian Affairs land management practices, including cattle ranching, which entails, clear cutting oak and hickory forests that are home to these medicinal plants that we value as Cherokees for our cultural uses. And so anyway, there's that element. And I think that is important to state, because, we're having these conversations within our own communities as much as we are with, entities like the US government, or whichever agency you want to pick. I guess getting back to your question about, futures and hope, we view, the Medicine Keepers work, and I didn't have a chance to talk about this, but we're working in tandem with our conservation projects. We're working with Cherokee young people to actively perpetuate this knowledge and these practices. And that in itself it's a land education program, and we call it the Cherokee Environmental Leadership Program, is a related component that a part of the NSF grant that I mentioned earlier. But that is a way that in itself is an act of futurity, as well as the Buffalo National River project, because, we think about going back to climate change, we look at where we ended up. And of course, that wasn't inevitable. It was due to colonial dispossession. But the Cherokee Nation straddles two ecoregions, one of which to the west has less and less of the plants that we know and identify as Cherokee, quote, Cherokee plants. To the east, we've been able to maintain a relationship to a lot, not all. And in fact, we lost access to a third, I think it might be more than that, 2/3 of our plants that we know and use in the homelands after removal. But we've maintained relationships, this is getting back to that relational continuity piece, to the plants that grow in what is known as the Ozark Highlands. And that's where the Buffalo National River, that national park, is located smack in the middle of what is now known as northern Arkansas. So I'll end with this concept, but we're thinking about it as an eco-cultural insurance policy. And that may be it's kind of a playful term, but at the same time, thinking about futurity, thinking about hope and optimism in the colonial scene, we're looking toward ways and mechanisms by which we can ensure that Cherokee people in the future have access to plants that we see are actively changing within our current territory. And that's amid, again, this kind of landscape of checkerboarded, or these islands of tribal trust lands that we have limited, access to and control over when it comes to conservation. So I'll end my remarks there and see if Darren has anything else to add.
Some fascinating examples. Yeah, Darren, can we get a take on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, what the only thing I would add, and actually I think Clint is better at this formulation than I am, around the knowledge systems that create, I think, and we use the two-eyed seeing framework. It's a Wabanaki framework from Elder Albert Marshall, and it's for and one of the key elements of it, and sort of it's very sort of Wabanaki, but I think most other indigenous knowledge systems related to place and stewardship have this, right, which is in a sort of an epistemology that the knowing of something creates a responsibility to it. So it's really hard to, and I think that's the that's what makes indigenous science or knowledge systems, different than Western science traditions, where the objectification can, has no particular obligation tied to the knowing. But I think, as that knowledge, I think that's why the stewardship, it's like Wabanaki, we think about it as the place, but the whole other side of this, and we mobilize this in our climate change work too, is rooted in the knowledge systems is our formulations of diplomacy as it relates to place, because diplomacy is place, but it's also process, right? So as we enact our stewardship, it also enacts management, it enacts knowledge, it enacts all of it, which is rooted in those core obligations. Our original treaties are not with England, or they're with non-humans, right? Than with our other tribal nations. So I think, those formulations just begin from a different place. And so I'd say that's also one of the pieces that makes the enclosure functions with the knowledge, right, as well, the knowledge system, right? That's why Suzanne Greenlaw tried to, she has to, during the environmental assessment phase for the gathering, in Acadia National Park, it's like, there's a kind of literally an enclosure there around the knowledge that can be, considered legitimate, right, and sort of creating proof that we're not going to harm, the thing that we have this high obligation to, right? And so these are the, then it gets again back to that sort of odd trauma, like colonial, and I think that's, if anything, that makes people more militant. Clint, I think it's like, we have to prove that we won't harm the thing that you guys have been harming for the last couple hundred years, and in order for us who had it, like, it was here for you when you got here, you crazy colonists. Now we have to prove that, it's this whole thing, and I think the colonial disorder is that we also use these regimes of mismanagement too for economic and other interests, but sort of how do we enact, it's like it cuts both ways. Like I like to play it out differently when we like I wrote a really hard critique of Shepard Crack's book The Ecological Indian. It's like they'll be like, well, you overhunted an animal back in whatever period, and as like why. Or I'll say in this work, one of the land trusts said, I know forested lands have been transferred to Indigenous people, and then they really cut a lot. And I'll be like, okay, well, we're gonna let's compare Indigenous forestry management with white forestry. Like it's these are the sort of denials that are sort of in this like moves to innocence or whatever it is that people who don't support this work are able to play out in both directions. I mean, that's why I try to play out the argument in both directions around the knowledge system as well. Yeah.
I'm conscious of time now, but we have just a few minutes, and I just wanted to point at that, raise that point that you just mentioned, Darren, with regards to how you're constantly asked to prove or like evidence in order to support your arguments. And since you're both Indigenous scholars, I'm wondering what's your take in terms of evidence related to Indigenous-centered conservation and to the extent to which it has contributed to advance the conservation debate, both in academia and praxis. What do you think about that? And very briefly, I guess, because we're just like wrapping up with this question.
Well, I'll say, so I really resonate with what you just said, Darren, as far as, thinking about, the complexities of having to engage with colonial practices, but also putting that in kind of relative juxtaposition to, as you mentioned, the large scale kind of industrial activity of settler society. It pales in comparison. And it's also structurally limited in terms of the choices that tribes may have for just supporting their people, right? And so we think about engagements with various types of industry. But at the same time, we look to, getting back to the question, Tami, that you raised, we look to places like Menominee or other kind of instances where that relationship to place and to sustainability, Indigenous sustainability, if you will, it is enacted very differently when you have that sense of sovereignty and kind of oversight, if you will, for lack of a better term. And so when we get to kind of like those questions about Indigenous conservation and how it kind of intervenes into in the discussion, where my mind goes is, and this is again picking up on a point you made, Darren, we can't take for granted that the national parks in the United States are this benign thing. I mean, obviously, I think people are more and more aware of the historical, what has led to their formation historically, and that has entailed Indigenous dispossession. And so Mark Spence's book is one of those, and many others who critique the National Park Service. And yet we still have these books, by like Ken Burns, America's greatest idea or best idea was the national parks. But kind of to add on to that layer, the taking for granted the fact that national parks, even despite that history, are today good things. Yeah, it's drastically different than from what likely and from what often surrounds the borders of national parks. But then when we think about the implications of this colonial enclosure, this conservation enclosure, as having excluded human beings, native people, from those lands, that's also an implication for the health of those lands. So that's where I'm kind of trying to push back against, like, okay, the Buffalo National River, as a case in point, is surrounded by agriculture, cattle ranching, things that we would generally think are detrimental to the environment, right? But the park itself is not immune from critique when it comes to, decades of exclusion of people as key components of that place, as key ecological components, if you will, of that place. And so how does that kind of push back against the fact that, leaving nature alone is a, quote, good idea. And so hopefully, in line with what you're saying about diplomacy as kind of being a container for stewardship or caretaking and knowledge that is in relation to the land, that's what we hope as well influences or is a part of this agreement, is that Cherokee people, in fact, it's in the agreement, but we hope that plays out in ways that actually improves this place as Cherokee people would through their knowledge. Anyway, that's a little bit longer of an answer than you expected, I'm sure.
These 19 people are still here with us. I will say that much like, in a longer version of the talk, I go through all these papers that are actually kind of like in environmental science and policy, or in biological conservation and ecology and society, that are basically saying, in conservation, the best conservation has Indigenous leadership. It has Indigenous people and if you think about globally, climate justice movements are, Indigenous people are in similar roles. And so I think, that evidence of those studies, where they measure the effectiveness of, the relative effectiveness, I think it's really helpful. So, I mean, I think, and they're mostly in, they're using this isn't Indigenous science. They're using, the same tools of measurement of conservation success that they've always used. They just are like, oh, let's look at it with and without Indigenous people. I mean, the deeper dive is actually like, the rubrics of measurement that might come from Indigenous perspectives. I think Indigenous knowledge systems, that a couple of the papers are starting to do that, but it's this proof in the pudding kind of thing is effective to a point. I mean, the world is, as we all know, is not willing to reorient the extractive colonial capitalisms, right? Just because some Indigenous people say the future of our human life on the planet is dependent upon it. But I think, in terms of influencing, environmentalists and conservation groups, I think there's been this real growth in it. So I think there's massive awareness of it. Putting it into practice is still in its nascent stages, but it is a few years down that road. So I would just say, like, I think Beth Rose just got a big grant to even think more deeply about this work, and I'm looking forward to that. And just because she's so good at combining all these things in her scholarship. So I'd just say, I'm really inspired by the scholarship and its efficacy for the work that we're trying to support here. But it's at its limits, right? And I think it's then where are those limits are where we can really push. And I think that's what I want, scholars to do, right? I want the scholars to kind of push that with us, and I think there's great evidence that's happening. So I think, that's where I'm at.
Right. Well, we've come to the end of our session, unfortunately. Thanks for such fruitful debate, and thank you both for being here, and everyone else as well. Special thanks to our organizers, whom on behalf of the Indigenous Studies Discussion Group, the Heritage and Colonialism Discussion Group, and the Center for Research in the Arts and the Sciences, and the Social Sciences and Humanities at the University of Cambridge, have been able to make this event possible. And well, I would like to invite you all to check their website and follow up on them on social media as well, just to remain attentive to a great agenda that they have put together for the next couple of months as well. So thanks again, Clint and Darren, for your time. That was a precious debate. Thank you so much.
I thought we were in agreement. I'm joking.
Thank you all so much, and just on behalf of the Indigenous Studies Discussion Group and the Heritage and Colonialism Discussion Group as well, we want to thank Tami for her great moderation of this event. And just to reiterate what she said as well, Clint and Darren, your presentations were so educational for all of us, and your discussion and conversation was so engaging. So thanks so much again for taking the time today to be with us and to speak with us about your presentations. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Yeah. Great to meet you all. And Darren, great to see you again.
Yeah, likewise. See you guys.